2016, and my name's Bob Wykowski, and I'm the chair of the Senate Environmental Quality Committee, and I'm joined today with my colleague Fran Pavley, who's the chair of the Select Committee on Climate Change and AB 32 implementation. Thank you all for coming to today's hearing. We hope to share some of the experiences and takeaways from the Paris climate talks and take a look through the global lens at our climate investments here in California, specifically the recently finalized second cap and trade auction proceeds investment plan, which I had the pleasure of reading last night. We will also have remarks from members of the Senate delegation as well as myself. Second, we will call up our first panel, which will be Secretary Rodriguez and Chairman Nichols, who will speak on their experiences in Paris and the implications here for California. After those remarks, the Department of Finance will present their highlights on the recently submitted second cap and trade auction proceeds investment plan. The Legislative Analyst's Office has prepared a presentation, and they will talk about the policy implications regarding the auction proceeds investment. And lastly, we'll hear from stakeholders' perspectives, representing first, transportation sustainable communities, second, energy, third, natural resources and waste diversion sectors, and fourth, environmental justice. At this time, Madam Co-Chair, why don't you have your opening remarks, and then I'll go next.
Very good. Good morning, everyone. I chair the Select Committee on AB 32 implementation, but I was asked to speak, or I think most of us are going to speak a little bit of overview on our takeaway from the Paris Agreement, and then some of our key agency people will also talk in depth a little more about their role. And just a shout out to the administration, the governor and the agency. They did a tremendous job in Paris, but the work really was before the event. It's been a busy year. So I thought I'd just talk about some of my takeaways from Paris and the difference between the Global Climate Summit I attended in 2009 in Copenhagen. Huge difference between 2009 and 2015. And to just real quickly go through sort of a bullet point list of some key differences. Number one was China. China was engaged and at the table. Frankly, I think the air pollution had gotten so bad in Beijing and other places that they linked, obviously, climate change and exacerbating the air pollution programs. I mean, when you're spending a month with masks on and your kids can't go to school and they can't go out, you get people's attention. So,
is it on? Yes.
Yes. So, China was engaged. Another takeaway is instead of sort of a top-down approach from Copenhagen, this approach had all the 195 or 196 nations all agreeing to do what they could do, their fair share, in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Everyone could participate. It wasn't just waiting on a few countries to do it. They didn't have the argument of developing versus already developed industrial countries. Everyone can do that, and they'll have to come back and report every few years to try to quantify, although they may not all have their protocols in place, their emission reduction strategies, and hopefully we can help provide some technical support. The other takeaway between 2009 and now, frankly, there were several pavilions in Paris at the conference center filled with businesses from around the world there. Climate change is good for business as far as innovation and investment in clean technologies. So even the U.S. Chamber of Commerce had a booth on climate change is good for business. I took pictures. May use that somewhere. Also, the difference between 2009 and now, California was able to articulate quite a big success story. You know, this year is the 10-year anniversary of AB 32. It passed in 2006, and so we were able to look at some of the implementation strategies and really talk about that it's been good for the environment and good for business. that this wasn't just wishful thinking. We actually have statistics to prove that you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and become more sustainable economically and environmentally in the state. Also, another takeaway from 2009 is I don't think there was a nation there that couldn't realize that the impacts of climate change are beginning now for those of us who thought this was something for 2050. So extreme weather patterns, longer times of drought, sea level rise. You have to meet people from island nations who will be underwater within the next few years to really drive that home. So that was a takeaway. And the final sort of comment was the role of subnationals. That's a term people may not be familiar with, but there's nations, 195 of them out there. California is not a nation. We learned that. We think we are. So we weren't one of the 195. But the role of subnationals, not the nations, but the states, the major cities, the provinces around the country, the MOUs that were signed between California and the other states, the role of subnationals in implementing strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is really quite inspiring from all over the world. So those were my takeaways from Paris. We have a lot of work left to do. This is just the beginning, but 195 nations got together on the same page. And just a political comment, I wish the reductions could have been stronger and more enforceable, but then it comes into a treaty instead of an accord, and a treaty requires the vote of the United States Congress, and frankly, the United States is probably the only nation that doesn't have a Congress that would have approved these reduction strategies. So that was somewhat clouding the situation, the role of the United States government. But Obama and Gina McCarthy and John Kerry did an amazing job in helping negotiate a real reasonable solution. And kudos to France. They were great hosts, well-run conference. The president of the negotiating team in the building, he did a great job. Hours and hours spent before and during. So California played an important role in this discussion. I was glad and honored to be part of the delegation and accompanying Mr. Wienkowski.
We'll always have Paris, Fran. Yes. We'll always have Paris. No, it was inspiring, and I think we forget. When we were there, we caught the imagination of the world, but we also did a lot of work, as you intimated before. I mean, for the public at large, this Under 2 MOU, which we and the policy wonks that are here grasp and understand, we invented the word subnational. That didn't exist before California and Baden, I forget the hyphenated word of this German state, got together, and the energy of Paris, as we arrived at the beginning of December, when there were 30 some odd signatories to this agreement that said, we don't care what our nation's going to do, and we don't care what the UN conference, we unilaterally are going to reduce our greenhouse gases or keep our greenhouse gas emissions in check so that temperatures don't rise above 2 degrees. We were disinvited to the American consulate on Sunday night because there were so many people that wanted to sign on. It grew to 87 signatories. There were so many folks that wanted to be in the room with Jerry Brown and the rest of the folks signing on to the accord. By the time Thursday came and we got the first draft of the accord, not the treaty, it was up to 123 signatories, and it created a life of its own. So I was optimistic, and it showed, as you said, Senator Pavley, 195 reasonable people could get together that represented nations that a lot of times we can't agree on what color to paint the UN, but they got together at least and said we want to make these, we want to prove the cynics and the critics wrong that we can actually get together and reach an accord. The global agreement has set the course for a massive investment in innovation in clean energy and for the next century. And it was somewhat of a kumbaya moment because the administration said nice things about the legislature. The Senate and legislature said nice things about the administration. Businesses said nice things about regulations that forced them to do things that we got the benefit that we got to glow there on the international arena. I'm obviously proud of the work that California did, but for me, it also Paris highlighted the magnitude of the problem that we have. I mean, the investment plan calls for $100 million a year. Of that, $20 million or $20 billion is going to be spent on climate adaptation. Now, we don't have, our current statutes don't allow us just to spend money on adaptation, but the world has decided that this is something, the resiliency and the protection, even as we reduce greenhouse gases. So that's something I have, I brought back and I said, I need to do more work, and the state legislature needs to do more work on allowing for funding and massage and improve the course that we're on. Yeah, the amount of the displaced people there, your heart breaks with the island nations that were there and the I mean, it's easy to sit here in California and say all those islands are out there. When you see the people together arguing and making presentations at different conferences and different sessions that we had, you realize that this inevitable climate impact is real for them, and it's nothing to take lightly. As I intimated, you know, I enjoyed being with the representatives from around the world on the climate adaptation actions that they're going to take. You know, we learn a lot from our neighbors around the world, and the panel topics included how to finance the adaptation efforts and this innovative decision-making tools to help build resiliency, and whether it's our wetlands or our carbon sequestration, and as well as to achieve some environmental justice, and how we partner with the private sector and on all these different subjects. And while we did pass the planning bill, and I'm glad to be the author of it on climate adaptation, planning's just the first stage. And the huge investments that are needed to adapt to the inevitable climate adaptation and the higher temperatures, and as you talked about, the extreme weather events, whether it's El Nino or it's our forest fires, it's going to the status quo does not work. And I know I'm talking to the choir here with the people that are assembled, but you know, most of our constituents like the status quo, and we have to be the leaders to effectuate change. So today I'm especially interested in whether we've struck the right balance on our investment priorities. And are we maximizing climate mitigation and some of our adaptation goals? You know, this is the second expenditure plan. I like to, my imagination has been captured whether the 60-40 split that we have is the right split of our investment plan, is the discretionary funds that we're spending and the appropriations that we're going to make in the legislature are going to give us the most bang for the buck. So you know, these are the highlights that I have from Paris around climate change. And at this time, I'd like to ask the Senate Pro Tem, who led our delegation in Paris for COP21, to make some opening remarks. Mr. De Leon, good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, as well as Madam Vice Chair, to the members of the Joint Select Committee, Senators Mark Leno, Mr. Hill, as well as Mr. Jubel. I know that Senator Ben Allen was just here just a moment ago. He just stepped out. I want to thank you very much, both Mr. Chair and Madam Chair as well, co-chairs, in convening this select committee together. I had the privilege also of representing our great state of California in Paris at the COP, the Conference of Parties 21. There we joined Governor Brown, as well as Madam Chair Nichols of CARB, and Mr. Secretary Matt Rodriguez of Cal EPA, as well as Senators Wachowski, Pavley, and Lara, as well as Assembly Speaker Tony Atkins, Speaker-elect, that is Mr. Rendon, and Assembly members Garcia as well as Bloom. So California was very well represented in Paris. There we met with leaders from every level of government from nations around the world. We had an opportunity to address members of parliament and national legislators from around the world at the French Parliament. We also had an opportunity to actually join 300 state legislators from across the United States, pledging to take steps to reach the 50% renewable energy portfolio by the year 2030. So that was quite incredible to actually have an opportunity to meet with other mayors, other legislators from throughout the nation that agreed. Well, we had a press conference, actually signed an agreement that we would move this forward nationwide to hit a 50% RPS portfolio. There, while in Paris, Senators Wachowski, Laura, Pavley, as well as our counterparts, our colleagues in the Assembly, highlighted the growth of the international divestment movement, which we touted also California's SB 185, the first type of its nation divesting in our thermal coal portfolio in CalPERS and CalSTRS. It was quite an incredible opportunity to be in Paris, which was quite historic. All the nations, sub-nations represented throughout the world. We had an opportunity to meet with individuals representing Australia, Israel, as well as Mexico and Canada. We had an opportunity to convene international business leaders to discuss clean energy investment strategies as well as financial opportunities in the state of California. This historic agreement at the Conference of Parties 21 sets a stage for a global race to build a clean energy future. And the power of this agreement is a very clear signal that it sends to the private sector. And I think already we see investors that are taking notice and markets are responding. Now, this international agreement may not be perfect, but I will say this. It is historic when you get all these nations to sign on and set certain benchmarks as well, lay a foundation from which to build from to reduce our carbon output. It's very, very complex. If you think it's difficult and complex to get bills in and out of the California State Legislature, you just can imagine having all nations, developing nations as well as Western nations in the same room and try to hammer out a deal, especially with the inequities that are so vast throughout the world. But now we know that truly the difficult work begins, and international leaders will be looking very closely at the California model. We have shown that one of the great economies of this world, the 7th largest GDP, which is the state of California, can actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other harmful pollutants without missing a beat in the global economic race. We have actually delinked and decoupled carbon from GDP, which is something to be very proud of. We have the empirical evidence and the data. So it's not subjective, if you will, commentary or spin. We have the economic data that clearly points out that we are successful because we have moved forward with our policies through the legislature as well as actions through the executive branch to reduce our harmful carbon emissions while at the same time not skipping a beat and actually growing this economy and creating real jobs that can be measured, that are tangible, that are real, and actually at the same time sending a very clear market signal to investors from throughout the world that California is ready to do business and create real jobs that have a real benefit for the bottom line. So California, as we know, has a very massive head start in this race. And thanks to our commitments and investments here in California, we'll actually be poised to reap a lion's share of the new market. It was quite interesting, fascinating to see JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, and almost every investor worldwide in Paris to try to figure out what the signals will be from national leaders as it relates to the new energy models of tomorrow. But again, to highlight and to showcase California, as you'll hear from our guests today, California was the star of the show. in Paris. Why? Because it's not theoretical, it's not abstract, but it's real, and it's measurable based on our policies that we have moved forward quite forcefully as well as intentionally. And that means increased demand, increased investment, and accelerated job growth for our homegrown clean tech industry. I know that I'm looking here that Mr. Louis Bloomberg is here as well too, and from TNC, and I know that we had an opportunity to meet with several environmental ministers of southern states of Mexico as well with regards to carbon trading. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you. And lastly, I would say that all the hoopla from all of our opponents, the naysayers, the doomsday predictors about going it alone has gone straight out the window because now we see that our foresight, our ingenuity, our innovation, but the political courage is actually paying off. And it's an example for the rest of the country as well as the rest of the world. I had an opportunity actually to be in San Juan, Puerto Rico, just I think maybe 3 weekends ago, where all the presidents of all the senates came together to exchange ideas on policies and to hear from other president pro tems throughout the rest of the country, but in particular from southern states as well as other thermal coal dependent states that our economy has really grown since the worst economic recession since 2009, and not everyone has actually benefited as of yet. That's why it's still our job to really move policies forcefully to make sure every region actually benefits, but actually to see our economy grow in such a manner because of our clean energy policies, because of our renewable policies. They actually took note, and be mindful. Statewide, there's only 13 Democratic state presidents or state leaders. The rest are Republican. And you had Republicans privately actually take note and take a lot of notes. So California has a lot to export for the rest of the country, and looking forward to our guests. And again, I want to thank you, Mr. Chair, as well as Madam Vice Chair. You really acquitted yourself fantastically well in Paris. You made us all very proud, as part of the Senate delegation, so thank you.
Who knew? No, all right, if there's no other remarks, let's dive in. I'd like to invite our first panel up, which includes Hayward's favorite son, Secretary of EPA, Matt Rodriguez, Ms. Mary Nichols, the chair of the Air Quality Board here in California, and Matt Almy, who is an assistant budget manager for the Department of Finance. Why don't we start off with Secretary Rodriguez? Good morning.